corporate social responsibility and corporate lobbying, explaining the influence of soft law institutions on hard law preferences. So global regulation operates on a continuum between hard and soft law. And the struggle between these two extremes has been central to many contemporary economic, environmental, and social debates on the appropriate role of business in society. Soft law has less stringent degrees of obligation, precision, and delegation than hard law. Over the last few decades, there has been an overall shift from hard law to soft law caused by globalization and neoliberal politics. Despite the significance of the choices corporations make between hard and soft law arrangement, there is limited empirical knowledge on how they are linked. Global multi-stakeholder initiatives on CSR is a specific manifestation of soft law. Its effect on business support for regulatory change has increasingly received scholarly attention. Research, however, has presented mainly conflicting results. Therefore, the question remains, to what extent and under what conditions do firms which engage in CSR initiatives support more far-reaching public regulation? Corporate lobbying is anchored in firms' preferences to shape public policies in a specific direction. Generally, business is assumed to be a unitary actor, typically lobbying for less stringent regulation. Business unity, however, is not uncontested. Differences in policy preference can be observed at the industry, but as well on the country level. I argue that there is also a critical difference between firms that participate in a soft law CSR institution and those that don't. I'm actually going one further to explain. One type of soft law are principle-based institutions. A classic example is the UN Global Compact, which relies on voluntary business participation to help meet the United Nations goals. CSR institutions can stimulate broader public policies by creating shared norms and understanding of what responsible business conduct means. They operate through mechanisms of persuasion, imitation, and internationalization. Through participation in these networks, normative rules about firm behavior are defined and disseminated, providing a vehicle for isomorphism. So this leads to my first hypothesis, which you can see on the slide. At the same time, CSR institutions may not affect all policy areas equally. Whereas social and environmental politics constrain corporate freedoms, economic policies often enable corporate activities. Most CSR institutions are, of course, focused on CSR-related issues such as human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. And this leads to the second hypothesis. And I'm going back to the previous slide that I showed you. And in this figure, I summarized the expectations. So participation in CSR institutions either socializes firms in new norms around responsible behavior or strengthens existing norms. As a result, these firms will lobby for more regulation as opposed to a continuation of the status quo of regulation. So, my methods. The sample of this research comes from a larger data set, which is called InterEuro. And this data set contains information on interest groups' lobbying efforts on 112 policy proposals put forward by the European Commission between 2008 and 2010. Building on these 95 interviews, a total of 1,043 lobbying efforts were identified, in which 224 individual firms were. And to quantify business policy preferences, Commission officials placed firms' preference on a 100-point scale, with 100 indicating the strongest support for more stringent EU regulation and 0 the lowest degree of support. In terms of CSR institutions, as I described before, I looked at participation in the UN Global Compact, and for there to be an effect, I logged it for 1 year. To gain a bit of a better understanding of the data, I start by examining the medians of policy preferences. So the top figure you see is across all policy domains. And here, non-business interest groups appear to lobby for maximal regulation. So maximal regulation is all the way to 100 again. Industry associations and firms not participating in the Global Compact lobby for the least amount of EU regulatory changes. And you can see that Global Compact firms prefer more stringent policies than both the outcome, so the exact policy that made it in the end, and the preference of the European Commission, which is the EC. You can also see RP. I'm not going to in detail because that's quite a complex concept, but often this is the status quo, so if no change happens. And then the second graph visualizes the results for economic policy. So here I divided the sample and indicates smaller differences within business groups. And the last one, oh, I see that there is a mistake. So I'm sorry for this. So the bottom one is the economic one, and the one in the middle is actually the social issues. So if I go to the one in the middle, the one on social and environmental issues, it indicates a maximum widening of the gap within business group preferences. Business associations and non-Global Compact participatory firms prefer the continuation of the status quo, so this is all the way to the left, whereas Global Compact firms' preferences align in this case with non-business interest groups in maximum regulatory change. And if I turn to the multivariate analysis, it shows that these results are statistically significant as well, providing support for the hypothesis that I formulated. I thought I would visualize these results instead of going to this table to give a bit more of an intuitive feeling about the data. So here you can see the marginal odds. So this graph shows that Global Compact firms prefer higher levels of regulatory change than all business actors. But again, when we divide the sample into economic policies and social and environmental policies, these differences only hold for social and environmental issues. So that is the blue line that you can see.